Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Amongst the traditional threats to manufacturing enterprises and industrial control systems are the escalating roles of state-sponsored hacker groups. Refined through recent hostilities in the Ukraine, more and more cyber attacks against critical infrastructure around the world has cybersecurity experts looking beyond independent ransomware as a service groups and malware drops to gain a better understanding of these well-funded organizations fed by the governments of Russia, China, North Korea, and others. What makes these organizations so concerning is that they're more focused on stealing data and manipulating operations than extorting funds. This means the challenges associated with dwell time and asset visibility now take on even greater prominence. We're excited to announce that this episode of Security Breach is being sponsored by Palo Alto Networks. Protect your OT assets, networks, and remote operations with zero trust OT security, powered by AI and machine learning while offering comprehensive visibility, zero trust security for all OT environments, and simplified operations. For more information, please visit www.paloaltonetworks.com/network-security. That's why we've invited Paul Ernst to the show. Paul will call upon his military experience as well as his role as cybersecurity lead at Rebellion Defense, a leading provider of adversary emulation tools, to help us better understand these nation-state threats and vital ICS vulnerabilities. Paul, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to Security Breach. So Paul, thanks again for the time. Really appreciate you joining us here on Security Breach. So we'll start off with a real light topic here. Let's just talk about some of these state-sponsored attack or hacker organizations. They've got some parallels to some of the things that we see on a more private sector, I guess you could say. But there's some interesting takeaways that we can learn from these folks as well, and how they've expanded their reach as well into really going after some of these industrial control systems. So maybe you can just kind of set the table for us a little bit and talk about what are some of these state-sponsored hacker groups like? What are their dynamics? Maybe what are the vulnerabilities they're looking at the most?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to really start it off, I think you start to look at, with the state-sponsored organizations, you really have to look at, some of their intent, what their objectives are. And so when you start to look at, different control systems, for example, like why would an adversary want to tap into those systems? And so, from, being state sponsored, that state's going to have, probably, they're going to have, something that they would like to achieve from that. So they could be seeking to gain, leverage or advantage on the political front. And then they could also be looking at early on, how they then tap into those systems. Because if we obviously look at, like a power grid, water treatment plant, pipelines, for example, obviously some of those things can have not only a significant economic impact, but then they can also have a significant impact on the local population. And then impacting that local population, for example, if you shut down a power grid or water treatment plant, you're then looking and affecting the people's will to then, kind of support some of the initiatives that we're doing as well as the United States. And so they're really starting in early to look at these different components to be able to figure out how they can, achieve an advantage in the cyber domain, and then gain an advantage on the political fronts, and then for whatever their nation state objectives are. And so, kind of what they're looking at today when you start to look at some of the vulnerabilities that exist across the network. The vast, every now and then we'll see the 0-day attacks, and that, can definitely, cause quite a few problems across the organization. But then there's also a number of common vulnerabilities, which these adversaries can use in creative ways to gain access to the networks to achieve their advantage. And so I think that's what we see most frequently is really the leveraging the common vulnerabilities that have not been patched yet, that exist on systems. And that is where they are focusing their efforts.
Yeah. One of the things I've always wondered about these types of organizations, too, is really what motivates them. I mean, you alluded to a lot of the political pressures that they're trying to apply, but do these groups get into the ransom element of it? Are they trying to shut things down? Are they trying to embarrass organizations as well? Or is it more the more that they can stay hidden and kind of worm their way through the network, the better? What's sort of their goal there?
Yeah, I think it really depends on, kind of to your point, what they're trying to achieve. So, if a state-sponsored actor did a ransomware attack, obviously they're getting to a point where they're gaining some control over a system, and then holding that system hostage, for example. So in that, to your point there, you're then, it's a black eye for whatever organization that they then went after, and it also highlights that here stateside we can be reached in the cyber domain, and then there's the opportunity exists for the adversaries to do that. So I think that's a big piece of it. And then to the point of staying hidden in the network, so when an adversary goes into the network, they'll also try to gain access to how we would see them in the network, so they can get better insights on how they hide within that network to achieve their advantage and kind of crawl through the network until they can gain at scale, whether it's access to data, access to control at scale, to be able to have a larger impact there. And in a lot of cases with these state-sponsored actors, a lot of times they want to stay hidden for as long as they can, to then find a point in time that's strategically advantage for them, to then, whether it's, if you look at, Storm 0558, on, right when our Secretary of Commerce is going overseas for a meeting with China, hitting that attack at that right point in time, and again hoovering up just droves and droves of data, which they can then exploit for their advantage during that time. And again, just really sending that message that we can, being reached in the cyber domain.
Yeah. So not to be too redundant, but really what the takeaway here is, they're looking to do pretty much everything they can in terms of getting in there, and really their result, it can be ransom, it can be data infiltration or whatever. I mean, it really runs the gamut in terms of what their motivations and tactics are.
Absolutely. And they could be trying to get access to data that would give them an advantage on the, technological front as well. Yeah. So looking for IP that helps them go, instead of starting at 0 to go to 10, now they can start at 5 and go to 10, especially looking at, China state-sponsored actors in that case.
Yeah. So there's a lot for manufacturers, U.S. manufacturers, to really pay attention to here in terms of some of these state-sponsored groups. So, Paul, I know you've got a bit of a military background as well in the cybersecurity front, so I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. And what I'm kind of curious about is, from a military perspective, when you bring in some of this new technology and you bring in some of the new systems, the element of security right from the start point is so much more important now. It's being focused on more. We've heard about people talk about ways to sort of implement those security protocols up front from an industrial control system. I'd kind of like to get your take on it from a military perspective. How do organizations there look at implementing security from the start so we don't have to hopefully play catch up or respond to attack, get ahead of it a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll kind of attack this at, from two fronts. If we look, across our networks, for example, it's securing what's in production today. So I'll start there. So, really, I would advise people to dig into on how the Department of Defense and the military really looks at how they secure their infrastructure. So there's a zero trust strategy on really that sets the framework on the different systems and capabilities that we put in place to really ensure that we're setting the technology, the people, and the processes up to really defend against these adversaries, preventing, if they do get into the network, and we're assuming they would get into the network, how do we then prevent the lateral movement to where they can then go achieve their objective and get access to or achieve whatever objective they want to on the network. And so a few examples of that, you start to look at, from the user side of the house. Are we setting up multi-factor authentication? Are we doing conditional user access, attribute and role-based controls? So across the board there's many other capabilities. When you look at your attack surface, the devices that are on your network, do we understand what's on our network? So, integrating capabilities to give you full transparency on how an adversary would look at that attack surface. That includes, for your endpoints, having, EDRs, endpoint detection tools on your network. And then being able to really look at the vulnerabilities, the laundry list of vulnerabilities that can look at, exist on a network. How do you then automate more of that process to start buying down that risk? Other verticals, networks, segmentation, data flow mapping, software-defined networks. When you start to look at on the application side of the house that exist in the, across the networks, it's really looking at, hey, what's out there? What sort of code went into this, particular application that exists? Log4j would be a great example of that. Like that was, hit in December, and it was just a mad rush to figure out, like, this is so prolific, Log4j, like where does this exist? And so being able to really have the data to dive down in that and really understand what exists on your networks. And on the application side, if we really think about moving cybersecurity to the left, you may have vendors that are delivering software to you. You may be doing it in-house in an IT department that's building out, software and capabilities that are deployed to your network to help, achieve those business objectives. But when you look at that, I would always advise, if you are engaging with software vendors, ensure that they really have a solid foundational, DevSecOps process. So really trying to validate cybersecurity to the left to ensure that those applications pushed into production do not throw vulnerabilities or avenues of attack into your existing networks. And if you have an in-house team, spend the time, spend the focus on training your team to ensure that you can, you're delivering those applications securely as well. And then kind of the last piece is, when you think about the scale of a large network, how do you then, from an automation and orchestration point, how do you enable the security operations center to then respond to those, potential attacks? How do you allow them to mitigate those early? How do you allow them to identify folks or threat actors that are in the network early? And then the last piece is really, the visibility and analytics, and it goes to, from behavioral analytics, we've got someone in our system at midnight and no one's ever working at the system at that point. Like, why is that happening? Those should send off red flags. And so really it's a stack to ensure that, you're putting into place all of these capabilities that make sense. And then the other key point of that is, like, you've got to train your team and you've got to establish the processes and continuously refine those processes and tradecraft to keep pace with these adversaries.
Yeah. A lot to unpack there, a lot of good information. One of the things I want to start with is sort of the human element of cybersecurity. You've touched on it in a couple of different ways there. I mean, we talk about zero trust, we talk about double factor authentication. There's sometimes a reticence for employees to embrace a lot of those types of processes or protocols just because they see it as slowing them down, especially in manufacturing. Nobody wants to take that extra heartbeat and do this stuff if they don't have to. What have you seen as maybe best practices to get employees or those who are involved in these operational systems to embrace more of these cybersecurity dynamics? What are some things we can do to help them understand the huge role that everybody really plays in making sure the enterprise or the network is secure?
Yeah, absolutely. You make a great point there, Jeff. So yeah, when you look at these systems, MFA is a great example. Like, there's an extra level to be able to then log into your computer. And so if you don't have educated across the workforce and across the leadership as well, you may have someone in an organization, the policies are really set on the DoD side of the house, but you may have someone that says, like, hey, that's a pain, turn that thing off. And then just having that education and understanding to say, like, what risk does that inject into the organization if you're not adopting those capabilities? And I think the other point of that too is really ensuring that your teams that are implementing these capabilities, managing the policies, managing, the users and everything, and have access to the configurations. One of the things with implementing all these new capabilities is really ensuring that there's training programs to be able to ensure that they're implemented and then maintained correctly. Because if not, you can put the best piece of kit out there on your system, but if it's not maintained, people aren't trained on it, you can still operate with gaps in your network.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of instances, just that training, I think a lot of times there's a feeling of, well, again, let's get up and moving. Maybe this is redundant. People should know this already. I think it just helps improve buy-in, helps them realize the role, again, that they're playing. This isn't just another, aspect of your job or another bullet point on your job description. This is real world stuff that's going to be so vitally important for the enterprise now and going forward, regardless of what you're making, the size of your organization. We've got a lot of folks who listen to the podcast who are definitely defense contractors, and understanding how all this ties together and could create huge issues down the line, not just for them, but for anybody else that they're attached to. So it's interesting. The other thing, Paul, that you brought up here a couple times too is that visualization element. And that is something in manufacturing and on the OT side we struggle with greatly. It's understanding all of the different API connections, all the different connected devices, and just all that inventory and everything that's involved, that it's going to allow us to see when somebody's getting in there and tweaking data, manipulating things just to see what we do, probing a little bit, pulling out, staying in, whatever the case may be. We don't always see a lot of that stuff. I can only guess that in some of your military experience, that visibility is critical. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the things you learned there and improving that visibility that we might be able to pass along to the industrial sector here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's in the way that we look at it, on the military side of the house in the DoD, there's a lot of compliance based roles in ensuring that any system being on the network, it goes through these series of checks and boxes to ensure kind of that it's at a readiness level to be deployed. I would argue it doesn't kind of moved into a very paperwork heavy exercise. But then when you start to look at the visualization piece on like, how do we actually understand what our risk posture is? And then what would that risk, where do those risks lie? And then how does that impact, on the DoD side, how does that impact our mission? If we, if an adversary got into a network and, shut systems down or pulled data out of the network. And so from that perspective, I'll give, one example. So you may have vulnerabilities, that exist on the network, common vulnerabilities. And typically it's hey, we're just going to start from the top, CVSS score, and we're going to work our way down. But really understanding like what would be the impact of that. So what other data is available to then be able to take a more risk approach to looking at like the impact to mission or the impact to operations, for example, in the commercial space. So what threat intelligence data can we pull in there? Can we do predictive models based on that threat intel to say, what would then be exploited? What's targeted? What's being targeted right now? Where is their POC code already out there that then would support the prioritization from that standpoint? So I think that's one, is really understanding where that risk lies, and then pulling the other data sources in to really highlight where that risk is. The other piece of it too is if you start to look at, some of the tooling, for example, for, the SIEM tooling, for example. So if an adversary does happen, we're ensuring that we can capture that, anomalous traffic that would be entering the network. And so, we want to be able to see that, but then also that could happen at scale, and there's so much data. So when you move beyond kind of the visualization piece, like how do we then create more automation, apply machine learning, for example, to make sense of that data and send those notifications to the folks that can take action on it to mitigate a threat actor in the network.
Yeah. I was going to wait to jump into this, but I can't help it. It's, we can't help when we're talking about cybersecurity to bring artificial intelligence into the conversation at some point. But is this visibility and some of the struggles that we have here, regardless of the organization type, is that a place AI could really be a huge benefit for the good guys? We know how the bad guys are going to use it to manipulate and probe. Is this maybe a great application to start with for AI and cyber?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Being able to surface up the relevant data that makes sense, that really highlights that, hey, there's behavior here that's out of the norm. Yeah. You should zero in and focus on this. So taking the needle out of the haystack and allowing folks to really focus and prioritize on that information. Because there's, on the cybersecurity side of the house, you may have a small security operations center. How do you then enable that team to be able to scale? So 100% on the AI ML side of the house there. The other piece is based on that data, and that I would call that being, human in the loop, sending those notifications to be able to react. Yeah. But then when you start to look at, different, endpoint detection and response tools, there is algorithms that can be deployed into those capabilities. That data can be fed to a machine in those systems to be able to pick up that and then shut down those attacks instantaneously. And so then moving faster than the speed of which a human can, but then obviously sending that notification to the team and then pulling up that data on like, all right, after the dust settles, like what happened, where did they get into our network, and then what do we need to worry about right now from after the dust settles from ensuring that no objective was achieved in the network. And I think that, and you hit on it, Jeff, with the importance of doing that right now in terms of our adversaries. You look at just the ramp up since OpenAI, ChatGPT, all the large language models that are out there, and all of those are being leveraged by the adversaries. So they can create exploit code faster. They can understand a network faster with those capabilities. And you look at phishing attacks, like they're going to get more sophisticated. They're going to look more realistic. Those will ramp up significantly. And so in order to defend against that in the cat and mouse game, I would suggest teams continuously look at how they deploy machine learning capabilities to be able to defend against that accelerating threat.
No, and it's a great point, and you made it, and I want to make sure that we shine a little bit more light on it. But a lot of these tools, it's not just about detecting; it's also how they can aid in the response, which I think sometimes is kind of overlooked. We're so worried about don't let anybody in or find them once they are. We have to do something once we detect those attackers as well. So I think that's a really important point you made there. So Another trend we're seeing, Paul, getting back to sort of the state-sponsored theme here, is a lot of these groups, especially when we talk to a lot of organizations over in Israel, they've really seen this sort of proliferate, and that's sort of this uptick in activity from hacktivist groups. So they're not necessarily state-sponsored, but they sort of insert themselves into political situations, can go after critical infrastructure at times. Are you seeing any other big trends, maybe from these state-sponsored organizations or hacktivist groups, in terms of what they're going after, the types of attack that they're unleashing, or any other trends there?
Yeah, and I think you'll see just the level of sophistication there. And so, when you start to look at, I'll go back to Storm 558, for example, and so. In that case, if you dig into it, is, hey, someone got access to keys to the Active Directory, which allowed them to gain access to the enterprise Outlook, get a hold of all those emails. And so when you look at that and you kind of, uncover the hood, it's like, how did they get access to that key? And so, what they did is they were able to then do an attack on a particular employee, be able to gain access to that key, and they leveraged that key to really achieve a significant objective at the right point in time that was strategically advantageous for them. And so, and again, you start to look at that and just creatively on folks are going to hit walls as we start to put systems in place to defend against these adversaries. And they're going to be constantly looking and thinking creatively on finding ways around those, whether it's, kind of using, accelerating with phishing attacks, looking at how they get into systems from, employees that may have access to, call it like AWS or Azure keys to be able to gain access to environments. And so you see a lot of that, and just, someone will hit a wall, they'll work to find a way around it. And we need to be very proactive on how we think, put ourselves in the mind of the threat actors, like how would they move around things to be able to think proactively about how we would defend against those. And again, I'll go back to it as well as, you look at some of the other points of, a lot of the common vulnerabilities are still leveraged by all these threat actors. There's well-known, they've got, chat, they share information on all these common vulnerabilities. They share their TTPs across the board. And that enables the learning across the board to then target, where these, where kind of the underbelly of some of these organizations are that may have those, common vulnerabilities that exist on their systems.
Yeah. So, it's interesting, Paul, and you go back to those individual factors, the logins, the personal encryption keys, that personal data that they're able to obtain through some of these phishing attacks and similar types of probes. I mean, going back to Colonial Pipeline, which is the one that everybody really looks at as sort of the turning point for industrial cybersecurity, that started again with leveraging some false login or some old login information there. So when we look at Colonial, we look at some of the other things that were maybe a little bit more militarily or government focused, SolarWinds, for example, or others. Are there any other attacks out there that you've seen, maybe had a chance to do a deeper dive on, that you've maybe gleaned some information or best practices that we can take away from and apply to the industrial side?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, I'll kind of go back to, ensuring, kind of that ensuring that you're kind of able to then understand, SolarWinds is an example where ensuring that you really understand if you're, delivering new software into your environment, you really want to have that trust that any of the developers or systems, that there's security and good DevSecOps practices around that.
Yeah.
Because if an adversary can get a hold of, let's say, a dev environment and then plant some code buried into, a software update, for example, that is a path that can have, instantaneously give them access across the board. And so I think adversaries are going to continuously, look at how they can leverage, kind of at the tip of the spear for something that's being pushed into the network, like a software update on a continuous basis. Like, how do we get in there? Because if you think about, efficiency, that, if they can nail that attack, that gains significant efficiency for them to be able to leverage that. And especially when you look at software that's deployed across industries, like where are there common softwares that are deployed, in density across these industries. And that's where they're going to be continue to target across the board.
Yeah, it is crazy. In a lot of these instances, it goes back to what I always call the blocking and tackling. It's really the simple stuff. If we can stop them off there, because that's where they're going to go first as well. So kind of not crossing those things off. So, Paul, we've been spending a lot of time talking about the bad guys. Let's transition a little bit. Let's talk about the good guys a little bit. What can you tell us about Rebellion Defense and some of the work you guys are doing for cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. Rebellion Defense, a little about the company. We're, a 4-year-old startup, venture backed. We're really categorized as a non-traditional defense tech company. We serve the Department of Defense, as well as we also serve federal civilian agencies as well. And so, what we're really focused on kind of goes back to, you have all of these different capabilities for Zero Trust, for example, that are put into place. But then how do you continuously validate that those systems can hold up against an adversary? So really where we're focused is we're developing and leaning forward, and we have threat research teams, offensive security engineers that are building out content, attack flows and kill chains that the adversaries would use. And we can put that into a SOC or into blue team so they can on demand, execute those attacks to be able to see how their defenses stand up against those attacks. So where that supports them is going in and saying, hey, we executed this attack. Here's how far the attack got into the network. Let's look at how we then reconfigure our network to be able to stop that attack further. The other piece of that is really continuously honing the tradecraft of the employees and of the network defenders that we work with. So they're able to go in and be able to, refine those processes, refine those procedures, and then also take that and, think through and come up with new ideas on how they can then implement different systems, AI, ML, to then be able to detect and respond to those attacks. And so really it's looking at constantly being able to test your network, just as any sports team would be constantly practicing, scrimmaging, testing out how they're going to perform on game day. Like we're putting that in the hands of the blue teams, so we can move ahead of the adversary and be ready for when they're going to do that attack.
So, that's interesting. You bring up the attack scrimmage, basically. It's kind of an interesting analogy, especially now football's kicking off and all that. But what is the typical response there when these teams do go, they face the results or they face a simulated attack? What is the typical response? Are they excited to get this information? Do they get kind of down on themselves? Does it open up a bunch of new, problems that they have to solve, or what's the typical reaction?
Yeah, no, I think it's, when you start to look at least on the military side of the house, across the other, branches, you've got, infantry folks, for example, that, before they deploy downrange, they're going through all sorts of training. They're validating that their tools and systems are good to go before they go downrange. So that mentality is really ingrained to hey, give me a scrimmage, throw something against it so I can then go, so I can get better. And so from that perspective, folks are excited to have the capability in hand to be able to then go and validate their systems and then train their team as well. So we have got great responses from folks in that space. And then I think organizationally, if you look at, out in the commercial markets, don't look at that as a black eye. This is a constantly evolving, space. And so we're constantly updating our run books, is what we call them, or the attacks, as the adversaries are coming out with new TTPs. So it really ensures that the organization is able to maintain their security posture with that constantly evolving threat. And then the other things we do is really help support prioritization as well. So if we're able to punch through one of the common vulnerabilities on the network, they're going to fix that one, right up front. And then we're actually giving them great from the visualization standpoint on what is everything that we have on our network. And so really being able to put yourself in the shoes of the adversary to say, what does our attack surface look like? To be able to say, hey, did we find any, rogue assets or, something that we didn't know about that was sitting over here? They're able to then remedy that. And so it's really an enabling function for the teams to be able to enhance their security posture and do so in the context of their missions.
Yeah. No, as a former infantry guy, we love those OP4 battle drills without a doubt. So I can definitely testify to that. One of the things that you've mentioned a couple of times too is that response. And again, I want to highlight that and talk about that a little bit more because I think it gets overlooked sometimes. What do you think have been some of the biggest lessons that companies or organizations have learned from you in developing a response after some of those simulated attacks? Have there been some really big points that maybe you can see repetitively coming to the forefront?
Yeah, I think I think it's being able to, you're able to respond faster. You're able to then, a SOC for the day shift, you can execute it, and then you can execute, the attacks, for the night shift as well. And so you're able to really, create a level of, proficiency across the board. And so that's a great perspective. And then the other piece with customers is really they want. I hit on it earlier. They want the at bats for the training. They want to constantly be able to, people in the military are extremely competitive. The competitive nature. So being able to continuously hone the tradecraft, whereas they may have not had those opportunities before, or they may have had, a red team come in once a year, for example. But what do you do in that interim when we know the threat's advancing? So really, really great feedback and insights from the team on really enhancing their security posture.
Excellent. One of the things that's kind of been proven out in both simulated attacks and real world situations is, especially in the industrial sector, we have this real gap in terms of cybersecurity specialists. We have a greater need for them than we do of individuals to fit into those positions. What have you seen in terms of either developing talent from within, going out and recruiting different people, or what can we do better collectively to get more cybersecurity specialists into these roles?
Absolutely. I think there's a few points. You've got your near term, like the need to pull people in, and then you've got your long term on developing that wave of cyber talent that we're going to need for the future. And so near term, I would always say that, kind of looking at spots where folks are, being really, where they've experienced a great deal of training from organizations, and this may be for the military. So when folks are retiring from the military or getting out of service, due to get out for the family or stay locally somewhere, like that is a great talent pool to really pull from. And then to pull someone who's really, oriented on the mission, hard workers to be able to go in and really add value into an organization. And then I think near term also, there's a lot of different programs across the country, with the universities focusing on, not only the training curriculum, for example, that the students go through, but kind of how they look at, for example, that from industry, academia, and government, the collaboration there on sharing those problem sets and focusing on real world use cases to further create that exposure for those students going out there. So one example would be, the National Security Collaboration Center, out of San Antonio at UTSA, which is doing exactly that. And they're oriented and focused on really tackling the nation's, greatest cyber threats. And so it's a great collaborative environment. And where folks, coming out of a university are really not only getting the outstanding training, but they're getting exposure to real world problem sets, both from industry as well as from the government side of the house as well. And then when we start to look long term, I think they've pushed out the national cyber workforce and educational strategy. And so when you look at that wave of folks that we're going to need in the next, 10, 20 years, how do we then set the engagement with folks that are in high school or even in middle school to create that exposure and that interest in going into this industry? And so there's great organizations, that are really driving to be able to create that exposure for the folks that are really thinking, they don't know what they want to do for the career. Maybe it's not cyber for them, but they're creating that exposure to really drive and inspire that curiosity on a domain that is so critical for this nation. And so you've got folks, I'm out of San Antonio, so you've got folks that are when you start to look at the Port of San Antonio over at Old Kelly Air Force Base, like they're doing a fantastic job of creating that exposure in that ecosystem, and then highlighting those real world use cases to get folks interested in this domain and this career field.
No, that's exciting to hear about. And like you said, it's only going to continue to be a bigger need down the road. So that's great to hear. Paul, as we kind of wrap things up here, just kind of want to get your take on any other trends that you might be seeing that are really going to impact cybersecurity over the next year and a half or so.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll hit on like one other point too that's very I think it's a trend, and I hope to see it increase. But kind of going back to the cybersecurity is 100% a team sport. So if you look at kind of the, out in industry, or if you look at a power grid or a pipeline or critical infrastructure, like if there were a cyber attack on some of those systems, it would absolutely it could potentially create an impact from a military base, for example, that was on that power grid that existed. And so I have seen recently, great collaboration between, for example, you look at, you look at the DoD, you look at down at the state levels with National Guard, you look at those critical infrastructure, whether it's a power grid or whether it's a financial institution. There have been great collaborative exercises on cyber ranges that have really allowed folks to operate together, which I think really helps for training against, if an attack happened here, like how would we not only respond, in the cyber domain, but how would we respond outside of that to ensure that, we're mitigating the impact across the board. So I really hope to, really see more of that collaborative nature, again, from industry and government, and share learning across the board. One of the things we hit on, the adversary is going to continue to evolve. And with that, you're going to have organizations that are really hardening their cybersecurity posture. And with this, the adversaries are going to advance around those. So I would just, foot stomp if you're an organization that's maybe underinvested on the cybersecurity side of the house. Really look at how you can then, get a good return on investment from investing in this space, because our adversaries are going to be incredible. The adversaries are going to be incredibly sophisticated, and then you don't want to be the soft underbelly where there's an open target. And so part of that's also understanding, what the impact from a financial, strategic level, like why would somebody want to attack me? So it's really, being able to really figure out how you then put policies, practices, and systems into place to defend and not be that soft underbelly. And so that's where adversaries are going to be going. They're going to be looking at the spots that are potentially easy to get into. The hacktivists are going to be looking in those areas as well, to be able to, achieve their objectives there. The other piece is, I really think in terms of from the looking at, software and technology that is really deployed. Like right now we have tons of cloud migrations from organizations like, hey, let's migrate to cloud. I think there's going to be, more attacks there. Because if someone's able to then gain access to those different cloud systems, they're able to then deliver an impact at significant scale in that case, and impact not only one customer, but dozens of customers, for example. And so in that space, I think it's being diligent, ensuring that if you're doing a migration to the cloud, that you hire the right security practitioners, have the right configuration, ensure your keys are secured. Because that is absolutely going to be a target as well. And then the last piece is too, like if we start to see, tensions between some of our, potential, China, for example, or Russia, as we see tensions potentially rise, I think we'll start to see, potentially an increase in cyber attacks as well from the state-sponsored actors. And so it's really being diligent, especially if you're a critical piece of infrastructure. Just knowing that, I think the trends will go that direction, especially if tensions rise in that space.
No, ton of great points there, Paul. And I know I've got one more question, and I know the response to this already, but I just want to make sure we sort of put some focus on it. When it comes to a lot of those cloud navigations and putting more information and more data and relying more heavily on the cloud, how much can we rely on the cloud service providers from a security perspective? Is it a shared role? Is it something we can count on them to cover, or what's your takeaway there?
It's really, again, it goes back to a team sport. So all the cloud providers have fantastic, security across the board. Where it gets into issues if you've got, maybe a public bucket that's out there that potentially has, a key that's sitting out there, the configuration, and then how you set up the configuration in those environments. If the end user isn't setting those up properly, you're potentially operating at risk. And so that's why I think it's so critical. If you had an on-prem infrastructure, hire and bring on folks that have had this experience, the security experts on how you put these configurations in place, because it's a team sport. There's great capabilities to defend against folks in the cloud, but there's also configurations that could leave you wide open on the user side of the house.
Thanks, Paul. And for more information on the work Rebel Defense is up to, you can check them out at rebelliondefense.com. Thank you for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Paul Ernst, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.